Vice President Kamala Harris continues to lead the polls nationwide in the 2024 presidential election. And today, Harris brings in another major endorsement, this one from the New York Times, who says she is the only choice for president. But with just 36 days until the election, many are worried that Democrats could see a repeat of the 2016 results. Joining me now is my good friend and colleague, The Hill's Mychael Schnell. Mychael, as always, it's great to see you. Look, I want to go straight to the latest Decision Desk HQ average that shows Vice President Harris leading former President Trump 50 to 46%. Now, this is nationally, and we've seen other national polls. This is an average. Other national polls showing a little bit more of a narrow race. And then, of course, in those pivotal swing states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, et cetera, it seems neck and neck. So what is the state of the race right now?
It's exactly what you just said. I think it's neck and neck. We've seen in all of these national surveys and all of these down ballot polls for months now show that this election is razor thin. Really, most, if not all, polls and surveys are falling within that margin of error. It's truly anyone's game right now. And yes, that is like good news for Kamala Harris that she's leading by 4 points in the Decision SHQ, but that's still extremely close. As you mentioned, that's just the national polls. It's not the down ballot surveys. So I think that this race is really down to a coin flip at this point. It is razor thin. The next 36 days are going to be fascinating.
You know, we opened the show talking about the New York Times endorsing Vice President Harris. Doesn't seem like much of a surprise, but you know, do newspaper endorsements carry the same weight that they did maybe a number of decades ago?
I don't think necessarily, no. I don't think they have that heft that they used to. We've also been seeing a lot of rhetoric, and, you know, the former president did say that the press is the enemy of the people, so it sort of makes it a little different when you're talking about the press and a major newspaper making an endorsement. But it'll sure help Kamala Harris, right? I mean, just in terms of her messaging, it'll let her go on the campaign trail and say, I'm endorsed by the New York Times.
Yeah.
You know, maybe there are some folks who still get their paper to their doorstep on Sunday mornings and read it from cover to cover, who this will matter. But again, when we get back to with this race being neck and neck in anybody's game, anything like this, it can't hurt. It can only help.
Right. And, you know, it was a busy weekend on the campaign trail. In fact, former President Trump continued to ramp up his attacks on Vice President Harris, this time questioning her mental acuity. Let's take a listen to that.
Crooked Joe Biden became mentally impaired, sad. But lying Kamala Harris, honestly, I believe she was born that way. There's something wrong with Kamala.
You know, Mychael, I've talked to a number of Republicans, I understand you have too, who have said repeatedly, we want Trump to focus on policy and differentiate how a second Trump administration would be different than a Biden-Harris administration. Doesn't seem like he's doing that right now. So is this will this continue to frustrate Republicans going forward?
I think so. I've heard from a number of House Republicans who say that Trump should focus, like you mentioned, on the policy and not on the personalities. Republicans say that they see themselves as having the upper hand and being on the path to victory. If the conversation is, well, whose policies are better, Kamala Harris's policies or former President Donald Trump's policies. So I think that this same rhetoric is not going to excite them. We heard from Larry Hogan, who's a different sort of Republican. I understand we'll get to him in a little bit, but he criticized those remarks from Trump, saying that, you know, it's not right. It could be, in fact, rude to disabled folks. So I think that this is not what Republicans had wanted to see, especially because I think that they have a pretty good hand dealt to them when you talk about, again, Trump's policies versus Harris's policies. They don't want to meander into this personality rhetoric, but of course, former president frequently finds himself back there.
Well, let's dig into that point on Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, now running for Senate. He's one of, like you said, a rare breed of a Republican that can go against former President Trump. In fact, some would say he has to in a state like Maryland, and he's broken with the party on a lot of issues like abortion, releasing abortion rights themed advertisements in the state. So my question is, how is he doing in that Senate race? Because on one hand, he's a very popular former governor, but on the other hand, in most of the public polling we've seen, he's continued to trail Prince George's County Executive Angela Alsobrooks, the Democrat.
Yeah, I think the question is he faring better than any other Republican would in this race? This was always going to be an uphill climb for the Republican candidate. Larry Hogan did win statewide with governor, but the Senate seat has been a different story. There have been Democrats representing that state. So I think that that's sort of the big question there is Larry Hogan doing better than anybody else would? But I think that when when you talk about, again, him having this independent streak and it working for him, folks know, and he knows particularly, that that's what he needs to do to win in Maryland. It's a place that has this checkered political history, and that is really Democratic leaning. So if he wants to have any chance in it, he has to moderate his stance. Now, the big question there is, will Trump be okay with that? At first, he wasn't, and we saw the two of them butt heads. Then Trump came back and endorsed him. Now, Larry Hogan just recently said that he's not going to vote for Trump. He didn't vote for him in 2016. He didn't vote for him in 2020. He's not going to vote for him again this time. Will that tick off former President Trump enough for him to go after Larry Hogan? Unclear right now, but it wouldn't be a good strategy for him, considering what it takes to win in a state like Maryland for a Republican.
Right. I think he's the last Republican who has won statewide in Maryland, so certainly facing different expectations. So I want to go back to former President Trump and his remarks over the weekend. He's also under fire for making remarks that many say happen to be reminiscent of the movie The Purge. Let's take a listen.
One rough hour, and I mean real rough, the word will get out and it will end immediately. End immediately.
Yeah, so not a very bright, outward-looking tone from the former president. What's the reaction been to those comments?
I haven't seen personally any reaction yet from some, House Republicans. It's what I cover most, but I can expect that they won't be too thrilled with this. Publicly, they probably will want to stay away from it. Congress is out of session right now, so lawmakers can get away with not commenting on these matters because they're not being peppered with questions by reporters in the halls of the Capitol. But privately, you'd have to think that they're not thrilled about this type of rhetoric. It adds to this idea of violence in the political atmosphere. We saw the 2 assassination attempts against the former president. There's still a lot of folks who think about frequently the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. So I don't think that Republicans are going to be too thrilled with any of this violent rhetoric coming from the former president. But again, I don't know that we're going to see too much public condemnation because right now Congress is out of session. A lot of folks are just focused on not this intra-party warfare at all, but having senses of unity in the lead-up to the election.
So let's stay on that because we know that there is this bipartisan sentiment of anxiety about what the aftermath of the election will look like going back to 2020 and 2021. You obviously, referenced the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the questioning of election results from former President Trump after Biden won the race then. But we saw that Republicans, even though they might have initially spoken out against Trump in 2021 after the attack on the Capitol, they very quickly fell in line. So do you think Trump, depending on what happens, neither one of us have a crystal ball, but will Republicans still fall in line no matter what happens post-November?
I mean, I think that's just a massive if. It's such a big question, right? Does Trump win? Okay, if he wins and he's the clear leader of the party, he's the commander-in-chief for the next 4 years, Republicans are going to want to surround themselves around him. If he loses, that's a different question. I'd say Republican establishment, but I don't know that that's sort of a tricky phrase these days. It's unclear who fits into that. But will some of the old guard within the Republican Party stick by him, or will they try to distance themselves from him and find a different forebearer? Because this would mean that former President Trump has lost 2 presidential elections in a row. He's been largely blamed for the loss of the Senate, for Republicans not winning back the Senate in 2022 because of some of the candidates that he endorsed. So I think that there's a big question then in that case. If Trump loses, what happens to the makeup of the Republican Party? Nobody knows, of course, right now. There are certainly some figures who you'd think would want to pass the torch away from the Trump MAGA atmosphere, people like Nikki Haley, Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney. But then there are, by former President Trump selecting J.D. Vance to be his running mate, it essentially made him the heir apparent of the America First and the MAGA movement. So will he continue to carry the torch for the Republican Party? All questions I think a lot of folks are thinking about right now, and it's a big reason why Election Day is going to be just so important in 36 days.
So we are just one day away from October at the time of this taping, and presidential campaigns are known for October surprises. But I would say this past summer, we've seen 2 assassination attempts against former President Trump. We've seen President Biden step down as a Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris become the Democratic nominee instead. So, going back to 2016, before 2016, but 2016 with that very infamous Access Hollywood tape, October surprises have certainly become, part of the discourse, the conversation. I guess, like I said, we don't have crystal balls, but what can we expect this month? I don't want to necessarily predict surprises, but for for those watching who maybe aren't as into the nitty-gritty of the campaign trail, what can they expect to see?
I mean, 6 months ago, I don't think anybody expected that President Biden would actually step down. I don't think that anyone could imagine or fathom there being 2 assassination attempts against the former president, one of which left him injured with his ear being nicked and leaving him bloodied on stage. There's been nothing precedented about this election cycle. So I think that if that was all before October, anything is on the table for an October surprise. We're just going to have to see what happens. But I think that one big question is going to be, will we see a debate in October? There's, of course, been this back and forth between the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign about whether or not they will debate again. Kamala Harris has accepted an invitation to debate on October 23rd on CNN. Former President Trump has said that he's not going to participate. No more debates. It's too late in the game. Will that change? I think that that's a big question going into October. In addition to just what does this final stretch of campaigning look like, talking to the final undecided voters, people who are still on the fence. Getting back to your initial question of the surprises, I mean, anybody's guess at this point.
Yeah. And speaking of, the time of this taping, tomorrow night, the vice presidential debate will be taking place. This will be between Senator J.D. Vance and Governor Tim Walz. We all have those famous sound bites from past vice presidential debates, Joe Biden versus Sarah Palin in 2008. Of course, Kamala Harris versus Mike Pence, the I'm speaking moment. But at the end of the day, Michael, do these vice presidential debates ultimately matter?
I don't think very much so, in the same cases that the vice presidential nominee and pick doesn't really matter. But I think that tomorrow's debate, vice presidential debate, is going to be fascinating. I mean, Tim Walz is going to be the biggest stage he has really ever stood on, other than the convention, I guess, but the biggest stage that he's ever been challenged on. I think it's going to be fascinating. There's been a lot of criticism of the Harris campaign that they haven't been very specific in their policy proposals. I'm interested to see if Tim Walz will be pushed on that. And then J.D. Vance, really since right when he was selected to be Donald Trump's running mate, he has just been followed by controversy, whether it's comments he's made, past comments that have been unearthed. I'm curious to see if he's going to be pushed on any of that and how he responds. So even though tomorrow's debate may not move the needle too much, and I always feel a little funny now saying that debates don't matter after what we saw with the June debate with President Biden and how that completely mattered, right? It changed the entire trajectory of this race. I'm a little weary to say debates don't matter, but this one may not matter too much, but it's going to be fascinating to watch play out.
Certainly, and I think you and I are going to be breaking it down after the fact. I'm looking forward to it. Another late night. I hope we get pizza in the newsroom.
I hope so too.
We will see. Mychael Schnell, as always, thank you for joining us here.
I've directed my team to provide every available resource as fast as possible to your communities to rescue, recover, and to begin rebuilding. I'm here to tell every single survivor in these impacted areas that we will be there with you as long as it takes.
That was President Biden speaking Monday as rescue and recovery operations are still underway across the southeastern U.S. following Hurricane Helene. The president confirmed that he has approved emergency declarations for 7 states and 3 additional disaster declarations for some of the hardest hit states. Biden said he will visit the impacted areas later this week as long as it doesn't disrupt rescue and recovery operations. It comes as former President Trump is in southern Georgia Monday to survey the damage. The former president is set to visit businesses in Valdosta and help deliver relief supplies. Meantime, Vice President Harris is back in Washington today to meet with FEMA officials. Hundreds of thousands of residents across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas are still without power. At least 120 people have been killed across 6 states impacted by the storm. AccuWeather estimates Helene caused between $145 and $160 billion in damage. Ryan Routh, the man accused of attempting to assassinate former President Trump, has pleaded not guilty to 5 federal charges. Routh, who has been in custody since the attempted shooting, is currently facing life in prison on charges including attempted assassination of a major political candidate and possessing a firearm with an obliterated serial number despite being a convicted felon. Hezbollah is vowing to keep fighting Israel after much of its top leadership was wiped out in several Israeli strikes over the past week and a half. Hezbollah confirmed over the weekend that longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah was killed in an Israeli air raid. Acting leader Naim Qassem says despite the losses, the group is ready for a long fight, saying that the commanders that were killed have already been replaced. It comes as Israel launched another strike Monday, this time in the heart of the Lebanese capital, leveling one apartment building and damaging others. More than 1,000 people have been killed in the past 2 weeks, according to the Lebanese health ministry. And roughly half of U.S. sea trade could come to a standstill on Tuesday, as about 45,000 dock workers at the U.S. ports on the East and Gulf coasts are threatening a strike. News Nation's Caitlin Becker is in New York with a look at why workers are walking off the job tomorrow and how it could impact your wallet.
Every type of good you could possibly think of flows in and out of these ports. I am outside of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and it is in full swing right now, but that is going to look a lot different come Tuesday morning if and when this strike happens, and it looks very likely that it's going to happen. And experts are warning that there could be a real ripple effect for consumers as a result of this strike. Those types of effects include congestion in ports and missed shipments, and that trickle down means skyrocketing shipping costs, a shortage of consumer goods, and disruptions in supply chains. I know we all have PTSD from that, from COVID. But that means we could see higher prices in the stores. And with ports up and down the East Coast and the Gulf Coast set to be impacted by this strike, it could take days to clear the backlog. News Nation confirming Sunday that nearly 85,000 longshoremen will strike starting 12:01 Tuesday. The Biden administration wanted to avoid this exact situation. They tried to get port operators to negotiate with the union ahead of the deadline. However, the White House tells us that they're not going to intervene if and when a strike happens. The International Longshoremen's Association, that's the ILA, and the United States Maritime Alliance, well, they've been at odds for months. These are the two groups negotiating. The last time they were at the table together trying to get a bargain was back in June. Now, the two main issues are over automation and wages. The union saying in their strike order, quote, USMX refuses to address a half a century of wage subjugation where ocean carriers' profits skyrocketed from millions to mega $1 billion, while ILA longshore wages remain flat. Now, the ILA wants a 77% wage hike over the course of the 6-year contract. And while the USMX offer is more than the 32% their West Coast counterparts got, the ILA is calling what they're offering them stingy. The longshoremen are also demanding that their jobs not be replaced by machines. Now, the cranes you see behind me here, well, they're operated by human beings, and there's a risk they could go fully automated in the future. Now, the USMX has agreed to keep its current ban on fully automated machinery, but they want to negotiate for semi-automation. That is a no-go for the ILA. The union is also pressing for better safety conditions at work. Now, the last time this contract was negotiated, some 6 years ago, apparently it was all hammered out months ahead of time. So this current stalemate has gone on a really long time, and it's sort of out of the norm. But we're hearing from both the USMX and the ILA that it is the other group's fault. Back to you.
Caitlin Becker, thank you for your reporting. The FBI announced Monday it has agreed to pay more than $22 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought by 34 female recruits. The lawsuit alleges women at the Bureau's training academy in Quantico were singled out for dismissal in training and routinely harassed by instructors. In addition to the money, the FBI said it would offer the women a chance to continue training and guaranteed placement in one of their preferred field offices. They've also agreed to a review by outside experts to ensure female recruits are treated fairly in the future. The suit is still subject to approval by a federal judge. If it is approved, it would be one of the biggest settlements in Bureau history. And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.